Before there was a nation called the United States, before borders, flags, or founding documents, this land existed in quiet continuity, shaped by glaciers, rivers, forests, and time itself. Long before clocks measured the day or laws were written on paper, life here moved to the rhythm of seasons, memory, and survival. This story does not begin with presidents or battles. It begins with distant footsteps, ancient migrations across frozen ground into a vast, unfamiliar world. It begins with fires glowing beneath open skies, with cultures that thrived for thousands of years, and with voices that carried knowledge long before history was ever recorded. Across the centuries, this land would become a meeting place of worlds. Exploration would bring ambition and faith, but also loss and violence. Colonies would rise, empires would fall, and ordinary people, settlers, soldiers, enslaved men and women, and quiet witnesses of history, would shape a nation through struggle and belief. The United States was not born in a single declaration or a single war. It emerged slowly, through conflict and compromise, through ideals imagined and realities endured. It is a story filled with contradictions, freedom and injustice, unity and division, hope and consequence. Tonight, as the world grows still, we will walk through that long journey together. From ancient lands to a modern nation, each chapter will unfold gently, allowing history to speak in its own time. If you find this kind of calm, thoughtful storytelling meaningful, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your presence helps keep these long stories alive, and together, we can continue exploring history, one quiet night at a time. Chapter 1. Indigenous Peoples and Early Cultures, up to circa 1492. Long before the idea of a new world existed, this land was already ancient. Tens of thousands of years ago, most scholars estimate between 15,000 and 20,000 BCE, small groups of humans began a quiet journey across a frozen bridge of land that once connected Siberia to North America. This vast corridor, known today as Beringia, appeared during the last ice age, when sea levels were far lower than they are now. These early travelers did not know they were shaping history. They followed animals, seasons, and survival. Over generations, they moved south and east, spreading across a continent that stretched from Arctic tundra to dense forests, open plains, deserts, and tropical coastlines. By 10,000 BCE, humans had reached nearly every corner of what would later be called the Americas. These earliest peoples, often referred to as Paleo-Indians, were skilled hunters and gatherers. They adapted to dramatic environmental change as glaciers slowly retreated and new ecosystems emerged. Over time, their ways of life diversified, giving rise to thousands of distinct cultures, each shaped by the land it called home. By 3000 BCE, long before pyramids rose in Egypt, indigenous societies in North America had begun developing complex traditions. Along river valleys and fertile plains, communities learned to cultivate crops such as maize, beans, and squash. Agriculture allowed villages to grow, trade networks to expand, and spiritual traditions to deepen. In the eastern woodlands, societies like the ancestors of the Iroquois Confederacy formed intricate political systems based on consensus and shared responsibility. In the Mississippi River Valley, large ceremonial centers emerged. By around 1000 CE, the city of Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, had become one of the largest urban centers in the world, with tens of thousands of inhabitants, massive earthen mounds, and a structured social order. To the southwest, ancestors of the ancestral Puebloans built stone villages into cliffs and canyons, carefully managing scarce water resources in an unforgiving desert landscape. Along the Pacific coast, fishing societies thrived, supported by rich ocean ecosystems. On the Great Plains, mobile communities followed bison herds, developing deep knowledge of animal behavior and seasonal movement. These societies were not isolated. Trade routes stretched across thousands of miles, carrying copper, shells, obsidian, food, stories, and beliefs. Languages evolved into hundreds of distinct families. Spiritual life was woven into daily existence, guided by an understanding that humans were part of a living world, not separate from it. By the late 15th century, just before European arrival, historians estimate that between 5 and 15 million people lived in what is now the United States. They belonged to hundreds of nations, each with its own governance, traditions, and worldview. There was no single Native American culture, only immense diversity shaped by time and place. Life was not without conflict. Wars were fought, alliances formed, territories defended. But these conflicts existed within long-established systems of diplomacy and balance. Knowledge was passed orally, from elders to children, through stories that preserved history, law, and identity. When the first European ships appeared on the Atlantic horizon in the late 1400s, they did not arrive in an empty land. They encountered societies with deep roots, long memories, and complex civilizations already centuries in the making. The world was about to change, but for now, in this quiet moment before contact, the land still belonged entirely to those who had shaped it for millennia. And this is where the story truly begins. Chapter 2: European Exploration and Colonial Settlement, 1492 to 1763. In the year 1492, the rhythm of this land began to change. When Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic under the Spanish crown, he did not reach what is now the United States. Yet his voyage marked the beginning of a sustained connection between Europe and the Americas, a connection that would soon reshape continents, cultures, and lives on both sides of the ocean. By the early 16th century, Spain became the first European power to explore large parts of North America. Spanish expeditions moved through present-day Florida, the Southwest, and California. In 1513, Juan Ponce de León landed in Florida. By 1565, Spain had established St. Augustine, the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in what would become the United States. These early encounters were cautious, often violent, and deeply transformative. Spanish colonization brought Christianity, new animals, and new technologies, but also disease, forced labor systems, and profound disruption to indigenous societies. Entire communities were weakened or destroyed by illnesses for which they had no immunity. In the north, France followed a different path. Beginning in the early 1600s, French explorers moved along the St. Lawrence River and deep into the interior of the continent. Rather than large settlements, France focused on trade, especially the fur trade. Alliances were formed with native nations such as the Huron and Algonquin, and French influence spread quietly through rivers and forests rather than farms and towns. At the same time, the Dutch established a small but strategic presence. In 1624, they founded New Netherland, centered on the trading post of New Amsterdam, located on Manhattan Island. The Dutch colony emphasized commerce and religious tolerance, attracting settlers from many backgrounds. Though short-lived, its legacy would shape the future character of the region. The most lasting transformation, however, came with the expansion of England's colonies. In 1607, English settlers established Jamestown in present-day Virginia. It was the first permanent English settlement in North America, and nearly its last. Disease, starvation, and conflict with local indigenous peoples nearly wiped the colony out within its first years. Survival came slowly, through adaptation, fragile alliances, and the cultivation of tobacco as a cash crop. By 1620, another group arrived seeking not profit, but religious autonomy. The Pilgrims, landing at Plymouth, formed a community bound by shared belief and strict social order. Their survival depended heavily on indigenous knowledge, particularly from the Patuxet man known as Squanto. Throughout the 17th century, English colonies expanded along the Atlantic coast. New England developed towns centered on family farming and church life. The middle colonies became hubs of trade and diversity. The southern colonies grew wealthy through plantation agriculture, relying increasingly on enslaved labor. This labor system would define the era. In 1619, the first documented Africans were brought to Virginia. Over the following decades, a system of racialized chattel slavery emerged, tying the economies of the colonies to the forced labor of millions of African men, women, and children. By the 18th century, slavery was deeply embedded in colonial life, shaping wealth, power, and social hierarchy. Relations with indigenous nations grew more strained as settlements expanded. Land treaties were often broken. Wars erupted, such as the Pequot War, 1636 to 1638, and King Philip's War, 1675-1676, leaving devastation on all sides. European settlement advanced, but always at a human cost. By the early 1700s, 13 British colonies stretched along the eastern seaboard. Though loyal to the British Crown, they developed distinct identities, shaped by distance, self-governance, and local conditions. Colonial assemblies emerged. Trade networks expanded across the Atlantic world. The struggle for dominance between European powers culminated in the French and Indian War, 1754-1763, the North American theater of a global conflict known as the 7 Years' War. Britain emerged victorious, gaining vast territories from France. But victory came with consequences. The war left Britain deeply in debt, and the colonies newly aware of their strength and their differences from the empire that ruled them. As 1763 arrived, the age of exploration and settlement was ending. A new era was beginning, one defined not by discovery, but by tension, identity, and the growing question of who would ultimately control this land. The quiet foundations of conflict had been laid, and the next chapter would challenge the meaning of power, loyalty, and freedom itself. Chapter 3: The Road to Independence, Revolution and Founding, 1763 to 1789. When the year 1763 arrived, the British Empire stood victorious. The French and Indian War had ended, leaving Britain in control of vast territories in North America. For the colonies, the war brought relief from foreign threat, but also a new and unfamiliar pressure. Britain had won, but at enormous cost. Its treasury was drained, its debt deep, and its leaders looked across the Atlantic for solutions. They found them in the colonies. In London, Parliament believed it reasonable that the American colonies should help pay for their own defense. In America, many colonists believed something very different. They had grown accustomed to managing their own affairs, electing local assemblies, and making decisions far from royal oversight. The distance across the ocean had fostered a quiet independence of thought. The first cracks appeared with the Stamp Act of 1765. It required that many printed materials, newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards, carry an official tax stamp. To Parliament, it was a small levy. To the colonists, it was a violation of principle. They had no representatives in Parliament, and yet they were being taxed. No taxation without representation became more than a slogan. It became a shared belief. Protests spread through cities and towns. Merchants organized boycotts. Colonial assemblies passed resolutions. Though the Stamp Act was repealed in 1766, the underlying conflict remained unresolved. Britain continued to assert its authority through new laws, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, each reinforcing the idea that Parliament held ultimate power. Tension escalated into violence in March 1770, when British soldiers fired into a crowd in Boston, killing 5 civilians. The event became known as the Boston Massacre, and though limited in scale, it left a lasting mark on colonial memory. 3 years later, in December 1773, resistance took a symbolic form. Colonists disguised as Native Americans boarded British ships and dumped crates of tea into Boston Harbor. The Boston Tea Party was an act of defiance, carefully staged and deeply provocative. Britain responded with force. In 1774, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. Boston's port was closed. Massachusetts' self-governance was curtailed. Rather than isolating rebellion, these measures united the colonies. That same year, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They did not yet call for independence. Instead, they petitioned the king, seeking restoration of rights they believed had been violated. But history was already moving. In April 1775, British troops marched toward Concord, Massachusetts, to seize colonial weapons. They were met by armed militiamen. Shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, and the American Revolutionary War began, not with a declaration, but with uncertainty and fear. As fighting spread, a Second Continental Congress convened. In 1775, George Washington was appointed commander of the Continental Army, a force made up of farmers, craftsmen, and volunteers, facing the most powerful military in the world. Still, many colonists hesitated. Independence was a radical idea. Loyalty to the crown had deep roots. What changed minds was not a single battle, but a shift in thought. In January 1776, a pamphlet titled Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, circulated widely. It argued that monarchy was unnatural, that an island should not rule a continent, and that independence was not only necessary, but inevitable. 6 months later, the colonies made their choice. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. Drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson, it was both a political document and a philosophical statement. It declared that all men were created equal, endowed with natural rights, and that governments existed to protect those rights. The words were bold. The reality was uncertain. The war that followed was long and uneven. From 1775 to 1783, battles were fought across the colonies. The Continental Army endured hunger, cold, and defeat. Victory came slowly, aided by alliances, most notably with France in 1778. The turning point arrived at Yorktown in 1781, when British forces surrendered to American and French troops. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris, 1783, formally recognized the independence of the United States. But winning a war was not the same as building a nation. The new states were loosely bound under the Articles of Confederation, ratified in 1781. The central government was weak by design, unable to tax, regulate trade, or enforce laws effectively. Many feared centralized power, remembering the authority they had just escaped. Yet problems quickly emerged. Economic instability, interstate disputes, and uprisings such as Shays' Rebellion in 1786 revealed the fragility of the system. By 1787, leaders gathered again in Philadelphia, this time in secrecy, to revise the Articles. Instead, they created something entirely new. The United States Constitution established a federal system, balancing power between national and state governments, and dividing authority among legislative, executive, and judicial branches. It was a document shaped by compromise, debate, and fear of tyranny, both distant and domestic. Ratified in 1788 and followed by the Bill of Rights in 1791, the Constitution became the foundation of a new political experiment. The United States had been born, not in a single moment, but through years of conflict, ideas, and careful construction. As 1789 arrived and George Washington prepared to take office as the first president, the nation stood quietly at the edge of an uncertain future. The revolution was over. The test of the Republic was just beginning. Chapter 4: Early Republic and Expansion, 1789 to 1848. When George Washington took the oath of office in April 1789, there was no script to follow. The Constitution had created a framework, but how it would function in practice remained unknown. The United States was an experiment, fragile, closely watched, and deeply uncertain. Washington understood this better than anyone. Every decision he made would set a precedent, not just for his presidency, but for the future of the Republic itself. One of his first tasks was to bring the new government to life. Congress assembled, federal courts were organized, executive departments, state, treasury, and war were established, giving shape to the three branches envisioned by the Constitution. Power was carefully divided, balanced by design, guided by a fear of tyranny born from recent memory. Washington's leadership style was deliberate and restrained. He declined titles that suggested monarchy, insisted on civilian authority over the military, and stepped away after 2 terms, quietly defining the limits of executive power. Yet unity was fragile. Within Washington's cabinet, divisions emerged almost immediately. Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, argued for a strong central government, a national bank, and close economic ties with Britain. Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, feared centralized power and favored agrarian independence and sympathy for revolutionary France. These disagreements gave rise to the nation's first political parties, Federalists and Democratic Republicans, marking the beginning of organized political opposition. Though the Constitution made no mention of parties, they quickly became a defining feature of American democracy. When Washington left office in 1797, the peaceful transfer of power to John Adams confirmed something rare in the modern world. Leadership could change without violence. But the young republic remained vulnerable. Foreign pressures, internal dissent, and economic instability tested the nation's resilience. Under Adams, tensions with France escalated into an undeclared naval conflict known as the Quasi-War. At home, fear of unrest led to the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, which restricted immigration and limited free speech, revealing how fragile liberty could be in moments of anxiety. In 1800, another quiet revolution occurred, not on a battlefield, but at the ballot box. Thomas Jefferson defeated Adams, marking the first peaceful transfer of power between political parties. Jefferson called it the Revolution of 1800, believing it restored the Republic to its founding ideals. Jefferson's presidency shifted the nation's direction. He reduced the size of government, cut military spending, and emphasized the vision of a republic rooted in independent farmers. Yet it was Jefferson who would preside over one of the most dramatic expansions of federal power. In 1803, the United States purchased the vast Louisiana Territory from France. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the nation's size almost overnight, securing control of the Mississippi River and opening immense lands to the west. Though Jefferson worried the purchase exceeded his constitutional authority, he believed opportunity and necessity outweighed hesitation. With expansion came new questions. Who would settle these lands? Would slavery expand with them? And what would happen to the indigenous nations who already lived there? Exploration followed quickly. In 1804, Lewis and Clark set out to map the Western Territories, reaching the Pacific by 1806. Their journey revealed the scale of the continent and deepened American confidence in its destiny. But growth brought conflict. The early 19th century saw rising tensions between regional economies. Northern states moved toward manufacturing and trade. Southern states relied on plantation agriculture and enslaved labor. Western settlers pushed beyond established borders, demanding roads, canals, and political representation. Infrastructure became a symbol of national ambition. Turnpikes, canals like the Erie Canal, completed in 1825, and later railroads connected distant regions, binding markets together and accelerating economic change. At the same time, the nation faced renewed war. In 1812, the United States declared war on Britain, citing maritime disputes and frontier conflicts. The War of 1812 ended in 1815, with no clear victor, but it reinforced American sovereignty and fostered a renewed sense of national identity. The years that followed, often called the Era of Good Feelings, were marked by relative political unity. Yet beneath the calm, unresolved tensions simmered. The question of slavery's expansion dominated debate. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 attempted to preserve balance between free and slave states, drawing a line across the continent that symbolized a deeper national divide. Under Andrew Jackson, elected in 1828, democracy expanded for white male voters, but at devastating cost. Federal policy toward Native Americans hardened. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 led to the forced relocation of indigenous nations from their ancestral lands. The Trail of Tears, beginning in the late 1830s, stands as one of the darkest chapters of this era. By 1848, the United States had grown dramatically, territorially, economically, and politically. It was no longer a fragile republic clinging to the Atlantic coast, but a continental nation driven by ambition, opportunity, and unresolved contradictions. The foundations of power had been laid. So too had the foundations of conflict. As the nation moved forward, its growth would demand answers it was not yet ready to give. Chapter 5. Crisis and Civil War, 1848 to 1877. By the middle of the 19th century, the United States had become a nation divided against itself. Territorial expansion had brought prosperity and confidence, but it had also reopened a question the country had long avoided: whether slavery would be allowed to spread into new lands. Each new territory forced the nation to confront a moral, economic, and political conflict that compromise could no longer contain. The turning point came after the Mexican-American War, which ended in 1848. Vast new territories entered American control, and with them came fierce debate. The Compromise of 1850 attempted to preserve balance between free and slave states, but its provisions, particularly the strengthened Fugitive Slave Act, deepened resentment and resistance in the North. Rather than easing tension, compromise only delayed the inevitable. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act overturned earlier limits on slavery's expansion, allowing settlers to vote on whether slavery would be permitted. Violence soon followed. Bleeding Kansas became a symbol of a nation slipping toward chaos, where political disagreement turned into armed conflict. Ideas hardened. Trust eroded. The Dred Scott decision of 1857, issued by the Supreme Court, declared that African Americans could not be citizens, and that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. To many in the North, the ruling confirmed that slavery had been embedded into the nation's highest institutions. By 1860, the political system itself was breaking down. That year, Abraham Lincoln, a lawyer from Illinois who opposed the expansion of slavery, but not its immediate abolition, was elected president. He received no electoral votes from most southern states. For many in the South, his victory was seen not as a political loss, but as an existential threat. Between December 1860 and early 1861, 11 southern states seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. They claimed the right to leave, arguing that the Union was a voluntary compact between sovereign states. Lincoln disagreed. In his inaugural address in March 1861, he spoke calmly, urging reconciliation, insisting that the Union was perpetual. But words could no longer bridge the divide. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired upon Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The American Civil War had begun. At first, many believed the conflict would be brief. It was not. From 1861 to 1865, the nation was consumed by war. Brother fought brother. Entire regions were transformed into battlefields. The Union, with its larger population and industrial strength, faced a confederacy fighting to preserve its way of life and its system of labor. The war unfolded slowly and brutally. Early Confederate victories raised hopes in the South, while the North struggled to organize its forces. Battles such as Antietam in 1862 revealed the war's true cost: tens of thousands killed or wounded in a single day. Antietam also gave Lincoln the opportunity to act. In January 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring freedom for enslaved people in Confederate-held territory. Though limited in immediate effect, it transformed the war's meaning. The conflict was no longer only about preserving the Union. It was now explicitly tied to the destruction of slavery. Enslaved people seized this moment. Thousands fled plantations, sought refuge behind Union lines, and later joined the Union Army. Their participation reshaped the war from within. The conflict reached its turning point in 1863. In July, Union forces halted Confederate advances at the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. At nearly the same time, control of the Mississippi River was secured with the fall of Vicksburg. From that point forward, the Confederacy fought increasingly on the defensive. The war dragged on, marked by exhaustion and loss. By April 1865, Union forces under Ulysses S. Grant surrounded Confederate General Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse. Lee surrendered on April 9, 1865, bringing major fighting to an end. The Union was preserved. Slavery, in practice, was destroyed, but peace would be brief and fragile. Only days after the surrender, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. The nation mourned quietly, uncertain of what would follow. Leadership passed to Andrew Johnson, whose approach to rebuilding the South would prove deeply contentious. The period that followed, known as Reconstruction, lasted from 1865 to 1877. Its goal was immense: to reunite the nation, rebuild the southern states, and define freedom for 4 million formerly enslaved people. In 1865, the 13th Amendment formally abolished slavery. This was followed by the 14th Amendment, granting citizenship and equal protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment, protecting voting rights for black men. For a brief moment, a different future seemed possible. African Americans voted, held public office, and helped reshape Southern governments. Schools were built, families reunited. New institutions emerged, supported by federal authority. But resistance was relentless. White supremacist groups used violence and intimidation to suppress black political participation. Southern states enacted black codes, limiting freedom in practice, even when it was guaranteed in law. In the North, commitment to Reconstruction weakened as economic concerns and political fatigue grew. By 1877, federal troops were withdrawn from the South as part of a political compromise. Reconstruction came quietly to an end. The Union remained intact, slavery was gone, yet the promises of equality would remain unfulfilled for generations. The Civil War had tested the nation's survival and transformed its meaning. The United States emerged stronger in law, but deeply scarred in memory. As the country moved forward, it carried with it the unresolved legacy of this conflict, a legacy that would shape every chapter still to come. The war was over. Its consequences were not. Chapter 6: Industrialization and Progressivism, 1877 to 1914. When Reconstruction ended in 1877, the United States turned its gaze inward toward growth, industry, and speed. The nation entered what later historians would call the Gilded Age, a time marked by extraordinary economic expansion and equally extraordinary inequality. Beneath the surface of progress lay instability, hardship, and unanswered questions about who would benefit from this new America. Railroads stretched across the continent, binding distant regions together. By the 1880s, steel mills, oil refineries, and factories transformed cities like Pittsburgh, Chicago, and New York into engines of production. New technologies, electric light, telephones, mechanized manufacturing, reshaped daily life. Wealth accumulated rapidly but unevenly. Industrial leaders such as Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan built vast fortunes, becoming symbols of American capitalism. To admirers, they were captains of industry. To critics, they were monopolists who controlled markets, crushed competition, and wielded enormous political influence. At the same time, millions of ordinary Americans moved into cities in search of work. Between 1880 and 1910, urban populations exploded. Immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe arrived in great numbers, joining African Americans migrating north from the rural South. City life was crowded and relentless. Families lived in tenements with limited light and sanitation. Factory labor was dangerous and exhausting, often requiring 12-hour days for low wages. Children worked alongside adults. Injuries were common. Job security was rare. Yet for many, this life, harsh as it was, offered possibilities unavailable elsewhere. Tensions grew as workers began to organize. In 1877, the Great Railroad Strike paralyzed much of the nation, revealing deep anger over wages and working conditions. Later strikes, such as the Haymarket Affair of 1886 and the Pullman Strike of 1894, ended in violence and reinforced fears of social unrest. The federal government, at this stage, often sided with business interests, deploying troops to restore order. But public awareness was changing. By the turn of the 20th century, reformers began to push back against the excesses of industrial capitalism. This movement became known as Progressivism, a broad effort to address corruption, inequality, and social injustice. Progressives came from many backgrounds: journalists, clergy, educators, and politicians. What united them was the belief that government could and should act to improve life for ordinary people. Investigative journalists, later called muckrakers, exposed unsafe working conditions, political corruption, and corporate abuse. Their writing reached a growing middle-class audience, shaping public opinion and prompting calls for reform. The federal government slowly responded. Under Presidents Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, new laws were introduced. The Interstate Commerce Act was strengthened. Antitrust laws were enforced to limit monopolies. Food and drug regulations were passed, including the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which aimed to protect consumers from dangerous products. Labor reform gained momentum. States began passing laws regulating child labor, setting minimum working ages, and limiting work hours, especially for women. Though enforcement was uneven, these laws marked a shift in how the nation viewed responsibility toward its workers. Women played a central role in this era of reform. Denied the right to vote, women nonetheless organized settlement houses, led public health campaigns, and fought for education and workplace protections. Figures such as Jane Addams, founder of Hull House in Chicago, worked quietly to improve living conditions for immigrants and the poor. The struggle for women's suffrage intensified. By the early 1900s, activists demanded full political equality, arguing that democracy could not be complete without women's voices. Meanwhile, racial inequality persisted. Despite constitutional amendments passed after the Civil War, African Americans in the South faced Jim Crow laws, voter suppression, segregation, and violence. Lynching became a grim reality. Progressivism, for all its achievements, often failed to confront racial injustice directly. By 1914, the United States had been transformed. It was wealthier, more urban, more powerful, and more complex. The country had learned to produce at unprecedented scale, but it had not yet resolved how to distribute opportunity fairly. As factories hummed and cities glowed with electric light, Americans stood at the edge of a new global role. The nation was no longer inward-looking or fragile. It was awake. And soon, the world beyond its borders would call. Chapter 7. The World Wars and the Great Depression, 1914 to 1945. When war erupted in Europe in 1914, the United States watched from a distance. Across the Atlantic, empires collided in what would become known as the First World War. For nearly 3 years, America remained officially neutral, bound by geography, tradition, and a reluctance to become entangled in foreign conflicts. Yet neutrality was uneasy. American factories supplied the Allies. American ships crossed dangerous waters. The boundary was crossed in April 1917. German submarine attacks on commercial vessels, along with the Zimmermann telegram, which proposed a German-Mexican alliance against the United States, shifted public opinion. President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war, framing the conflict as a defense of democracy itself. American troops arrived in Europe in 1918, fresh, numerous, and decisive. Though the war would end later that year with an Allied victory, its impact on the United States was profound. The nation emerged with increased global influence and a growing sense of responsibility beyond its borders. Yet peace brought uncertainty. Wilson traveled to Paris in 1919, advocating for a new international order through the League of Nations. At home, however, the Senate rejected membership, reflecting America's enduring desire to remain apart from European affairs. The years that followed were restless. The 1920s brought rapid economic growth, technological innovation, and cultural change. Automobiles filled streets. Radios carried voices into living rooms. Consumer credit expanded. Stock markets soared. But beneath the surface, the economy was fragile. On October 29, 1929, known as Black Tuesday, the stock market collapsed. Confidence evaporated. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Millions lost their jobs. The Great Depression spread quickly, touching nearly every household. By 1933, nearly 1/4 of the workforce was unemployed. Families stood in breadlines. Farmers watched crops rot as prices collapsed. The promise of endless prosperity had vanished. That same year, Franklin D. Roosevelt took office as president. In his first inaugural address, he spoke calmly, reassuring a shaken nation that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Roosevelt's response became known as the New Deal. Between 1933 and 1939, the federal government expanded its role in American life. Public works programs employed millions. Banks were regulated. Social Security was established, offering a safety net for the elderly and unemployed. Labor unions gained new protections. The New Deal did not end the Depression entirely, but it reshaped the relationship between citizens and government, embedding the idea that federal authority could act as a stabilizing force in times of crisis. As America struggled to recover, the world darkened again. In Europe, authoritarian regimes rose. In Asia, imperial ambitions expanded. By 1939, war returned. This time, on a far greater scale. Once again, the United States hesitated. At first, America sought to remain neutral in World War II, though it provided material support to Allied nations through programs like Lend-Lease. President Roosevelt warned of growing danger, even as much of the public resisted involvement. That resistance ended on December 7th, 1941. On that morning, Japanese forces attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Within hours, the United States declared war on Japan. Days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. America was fully engaged. The nation mobilized with unprecedented speed. Factories shifted from consumer goods to tanks, planes, and ships. Women entered the workforce in massive numbers. Soldiers crossed oceans. The war effort transformed society, accelerating industrial capacity and scientific innovation. The conflict was vast and costly. American forces fought across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. Key moments: D-Day in June 1944, the liberation of Paris, the island-hopping campaigns in the Pacific, slowly turned the tide. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. In August, after fierce fighting and immense loss of life, Japan surrendered following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. World War II was over. The United States emerged changed. Its cities stood intact, while much of Europe and Asia lay in ruins. Its economy was strengthened, not shattered. Its military reach spanned the globe. The nation possessed not only industrial power, but unprecedented influence. By 1945, the United States had moved from reluctant participant to central architect of the post-war world. It would help establish new international institutions. It would shape global economics, security, and diplomacy. And it would soon face a new kind of conflict, one fought not on battlefields alone, but through ideology, technology, and power. The era of isolation had ended. America had stepped onto the world stage, and it would not step back.
Chapter 8: Cold War and Civil Rights Era, 1945 to 1980. When the Second World War ended in 1945, the world did not settle into peace. Instead, a new tension quietly took its place. Two victorious powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, emerged with sharply different visions of the future. One championed democratic capitalism. The other promoted communist central planning. They would not fight each other directly, but their rivalry would shape nearly every corner of the globe. This period became known as the Cold War. At its heart was fear. Fear of ideological defeat, fear of military imbalance, and fear of nuclear annihilation. Both nations raced to build weapons more destructive than any before. By the late 1940s, the atomic bomb had altered the meaning of war itself. In 1947, President Harry S. Truman announced what became known as the Truman Doctrine, pledging American support to nations resisting communism. Soon after, the Marshall Plan helped rebuild Western Europe, stabilizing economies and strengthening alliances. The world divided into spheres of influence. In 1950, war broke out on the Korean Peninsula. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, ended without a clear victory, but it confirmed a new reality. The United States would engage in distant conflicts to contain the spread of communism. At home, anxiety shaped daily life. Civil defense drills became routine. Fallout shelters appeared in cities and suburbs. The fear of infiltration led to political suspicion, most notably during the era of McCarthyism in the early 1950s. when accusations of communist influence spread through government, media, and culture. Yet amid tension, American society continued to change. The post-war economy boomed, suburbs expanded, highways stretched across the nation, consumer goods filled homes, television brought the world into living rooms, shaping a shared national experience. But prosperity was not evenly shared. For millions of African Americans, segregation remained law and custom, especially in the South. Despite constitutional guarantees, daily life was shaped by Jim Crow laws, voter suppression, and violence. Change began quietly, then steadily. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. The decision challenged the legal foundation of segregation, though resistance was fierce. 1 year later, in 1955, a seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Her arrest sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, led by a young minister named Martin Luther King Jr. For over a year, Black residents walked rather than ride segregated buses, demonstrating the power of nonviolent protest. The civil rights movement gained momentum. Throughout the 1960s, sit-ins, marches, and voter registration drives spread across the South. Images of peaceful protesters facing police dogs and fire hoses shocked the nation. The struggle was no longer invisible.
In 1964, the Civil Rights Act outlawed segregation in public spaces and employment discrimination. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act targeted barriers that had long prevented African Americans from voting. These laws marked historic victories, but they did not end inequality. Urban unrest, economic disparity, and racial tension continued to challenge the nation's conscience. At the same time, the Cold War intensified abroad. In 1961, the construction of the Berlin Wall symbolized a divided world. The following year, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the United States and the Soviet Union closer to nuclear war than ever before. For 13 days, the world waited in silence, uncertain if morning would come. It did. Gradually, the superpowers stepped back, recognizing the catastrophic consequences of escalation. Competition took other forms. In 1969, the United States achieved a symbolic victory in the space race when Apollo 11 landed on the moon. As Neil Armstrong stepped onto lunar soil, millions watched from Earth. It was a moment of shared wonder, proof of scientific ambition, national pride, and human possibility. Yet even as America reached outward, conflict deepened at home and abroad. The Vietnam War defined a generation. What began as advisory support in the 1950s expanded into full military involvement by the mid-1960s. The war dragged on, televised into American homes, raising difficult questions about power, morality, and purpose. Protests spread across college campuses and city streets. Trust in government eroded. The assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy in 1968 deepened a sense of national loss. By the early 1970s, the United States began withdrawing from Vietnam. In 1975, the war ended with the fall of Saigon. The outcome left scars on veterans, families, and public faith in leadership. The final years of this era were marked by uncertainty. Economic challenges emerged. The Watergate scandal, culminating in President Richard Nixon's resignation in 1974, revealed the fragility of democratic trust. Energy crises and inflation reshaped daily life. By 1980, the United States had changed profoundly. It had confronted segregation and expanded civil rights, though equality remained incomplete. It had navigated nuclear fear without catastrophe. It had walked on the moon and struggled through distant wars. The nation emerged more self-aware, less certain, and deeply complex. The Cold War was not over, but America had learned that its greatest challenges were not only external. They lived within its own society. And the next chapter would explore how the nation carried these lessons into a rapidly changing world.
Chapter 9: Post-Cold War and Global Leadership, 1980 to 2016. As the 1980s began, the United States stood at a turning point. Decades of Cold War tension had shaped American politics, culture, and identity. Fear of nuclear conflict lingered, yet the world was slowly changing. Economic pressure, political reform, and public unrest were reshaping the Soviet Union, and with it, the global order. In 1981, Ronald Reagan became president, promising renewed confidence at home and strength abroad. His administration emphasized military expansion, tax cuts, and a belief that American power, economic and ideological, could help bring the Cold War to an end. By the mid-1980s, dialogue replaced confrontation. In 1987, Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, reducing nuclear arsenals on both sides. It was a quiet but historic step away from perpetual standoff. Then, in 1989, a symbolic barrier fell. The Berlin Wall, long a physical and ideological divide, was opened. 2 years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union formally dissolved. The Cold War ended not with a final battle, but with exhaustion, reform, and collapse. The United States emerged as the world's sole superpower. The 1990s brought a sense of cautious optimism. Under President George H.W. Bush, the U.S. led a coalition during the Gulf War, 1990 to 1991, responding to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. The conflict was swift, reinforcing American military dominance and shaping a new role as global enforcer. Soon after, Bill Clinton assumed the presidency in 1993. His years in office coincided with economic growth driven by globalization, technological innovation, and the early rise of the Internet. Markets expanded, information moved faster than ever before. Yet stability was fragile. Globalization brought opportunity, but also inequality. Manufacturing jobs declined in many regions. Financial markets grew increasingly complex. Abroad, ethnic conflicts erupted in places like the Balkans, drawing limited American intervention. At home, political divisions sharpened. Clinton's presidency ended amid scandal and impeachment proceedings, reflecting a growing polarization in public life. As the new millennium began, the United States entered it with confidence and little sense of the shock to come. On the morning of September 11, 2001, that confidence was shattered. Coordinated terrorist attacks struck New York City and Washington, D.C., killing nearly 3,000 people. The destruction unfolded live on television screens around the world. For many Americans, time seemed to stop. The response was swift. Under President George W. Bush, the United States declared a war on terror, reshaping domestic policy and foreign relations. Within weeks, American forces entered Afghanistan, targeting al-Qaeda and the Taliban regime that sheltered it. In 2003, the U.S. led an invasion of Iraq, citing concerns over weapons of mass destruction.
The initial military campaign was quick, but the aftermath was not. Insurgency, instability, and prolonged conflict followed. These wars defined a generation. They reshaped military doctrine, expanded surveillance and security measures, and sparked debate over civil liberties, international law, and America's role in the world. Trust in institutions was tested once again. Meanwhile, economic forces gathered quietly. In 2008, a financial crisis erupted, triggered by the collapse of the housing market and the failure of major financial institutions. Banks faltered. Markets plunged. Millions lost homes and jobs. The crisis marked the most severe economic downturn since the Great Depression. That same year, Americans elected Barack Obama as president, the nation's first African-American leader. His victory was widely seen as a symbol of social progress, though challenges remained immense. Obama's administration focused on economic recovery, passing stimulus measures and reforming the financial sector. In 2010, the Affordable Care Act became law, expanding health insurance coverage and redefining the government's role in healthcare. Abroad, Obama sought to recalibrate American power, reducing troop levels in Iraq, emphasizing diplomacy, and shifting attention toward global cooperation. In 2011, US forces killed Osama bin Laden, bringing a sense of closure to a decade-long pursuit. Yet the world remained unstable. The Arab Spring reshaped the Middle East. Civil war erupted in Syria. Terrorist threats evolved rather than disappeared. At home, debates over inequality, race, technology, and identity intensified. By 2016, the United States stood in a complex position. It remained economically powerful and militarily dominant. Its culture and technology influenced the globe. Yet confidence in institutions had eroded. Political discourse had hardened. The gap between ideals and reality felt more visible than ever. The post-Cold War era had not delivered a simple peace. Instead, it revealed a new truth. Power brought responsibility, but also uncertainty. Leadership demanded constant reassessment, not only of enemies abroad, but of values at home. As the nation approached the present day, it carried the weight of its global role alongside unresolved internal questions. The story of the United States was no longer just about becoming powerful. It was about deciding what that power should mean. And the final chapter would explore how America entered the 21st century, still searching, still changing, and still unfinished.
Chapter 10. Contemporary United States, 2016, present. By 2016, the United States had entered a new and unsettled chapter. Decades of globalization, technological change, and political strain had reshaped American life. Economic growth coexisted with inequality. Digital connection expanded even as social trust weakened. The country remained powerful, but increasingly divided, uncertain not of its strength, but of its direction. The presidential election of 2016 exposed deep fractures within American society. Political discourse hardened. Media landscapes fragmented. Questions about identity, representation, and truth moved from the margins to the center of public life. These divisions did not emerge suddenly. They had been building quietly for years. Technology played a central role. Social media platforms transformed how Americans communicated, consumed information, and organized politically. News traveled instantly, often without context. Algorithms amplified emotion. The boundaries between public and private life blurred. At the same time, technological innovation reshaped the economy. Automation, artificial intelligence, and remote work altered traditional labor patterns. Entire industries evolved, while others faded. Opportunity expanded for some and narrowed for others. The nation also faced growing environmental urgency. Climate change moved from scientific debate to lived experience. Wildfires, hurricanes, droughts, and rising sea levels became regular features of the national conversation. Policy responses varied, but the long-term challenge remained clear. Decisions made in the present would shape generations yet to come. Immigration, long central to the American story, once again became a focal point. Debates intensified over borders, asylum, citizenship, and national identity. For some, immigration represented renewal. For others, anxiety. The tension reflected an older question: who belongs, and on what terms? Internationally, the United States navigated a shifting world. New powers emerged. Long-standing alliances were reassessed. Trade, security, and diplomacy grew more complex. The country remained deeply influential, but no longer unchallenged. Leadership required balance between strength and cooperation, principle and pragmatism. Then came 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic altered daily life in ways few could have imagined. Streets emptied, schools closed, hospitals filled. Millions lost loved ones, livelihoods, or a sense of certainty. The crisis revealed both vulnerability and resilience, weakness in systems, strength in communities. Amid the pandemic, conversations about race, justice, and equality intensified. Protests spread across cities following acts of racial violence, echoing struggles from earlier chapters of American history. The past, it seemed, was never truly past. The early 2020s continued to test the nation. Elections remained contentious. Trust in institutions fluctuated. Yet even in uncertainty, democratic processes endured. Power changed hands, courts functioned, civil society persisted, sometimes strained, sometimes renewed. Today, the United States stands not at an ending, but at a pause. It is a country still shaped by its history, by ideals declared centuries ago, by conflicts endured, by compromises made and unmade. Its story is unfinished, written not only by leaders and laws, but by ordinary people navigating everyday choices in an extraordinary time. As night settles and the noise of the day fades, this long journey, from ancient lands to modern uncertainty, comes gently to rest. History does not conclude here. It continues quietly, moment by moment, shaped by questions yet unanswered and futures yet imagined. If this calm exploration of history has kept you company tonight, you are warmly invited to subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Your presence helps shape what stories we tell next. Would you like to continue with another long-form bedtime history, or explore a single moment in deeper detail? For now, let the story rest, and let tomorrow decide the next chapter.